At the desire of the neighboring ministers, he drew up an agreement for church order and concord, containing only so much church order and discipline as he apprehended the Episcopal, Presbyterian, and Independent were agreed in, as belonging to the pastors of each particular church, which he afterwards published in a book called Christian Concord, and the ministers of those parts associated upon that bottom, not disputing with each other in order to an agreement in their opinions, but agreeing in that practice of what was owned by all. Upon Oliver's becoming protector, the extent of the toleration was the subject of many debates. The Committee of Parliament proposed that it should be extended to all that held the fundamentals of religion. Hereupon it was queried, which were the fundamentals of religion? And it was agreed that the members of the committee, who were 14 in number, should each of them nominate a divine, and that they meeting together should draw up a list of the fundamentals to be as a test to the toleration. Mr. Baxter was upon this occasion nominated for one, in the room of Archbishop Usher, who refused, but Lord Brockhale, and took a journey accordingly to London. There he met Mr. Marshall, Mr. Rayner, Dr. Chanel, Dr. Goodwin, Dr. Owen, Mr. Nye, Mr. Sider Simpson, Mr. Vines, Mr. Manton, and Mr. Jacob, who were also nominated. Mr. Baxter was for offering to the Parliament the Creed, the Lord's Prayer, and 10 Commandments as the fundamentals of Christianity, but the rest were not for so large a bottom. But the rest were not for so large a bottom, but were for having a greater number of fundamentals. If he did no other service among them, he at least prevented the running many things so high as might otherwise have been expected. Truth and peace were the things he earnestly pursued all his days. He by writing treated with Dr. Brownrigg, Bishop of Exeter, about concord with the diocesan party in this nation, and made also some proposals to Dr. Hammond to this purpose a little before the restoration of King Charles. By means of Mr. Lamb and Mr. Allen, 2 Anabaptist ministers whom he prevailed with to quit the way of separation, he dealt with the rest of the Anabaptists about communion with other churches. He treated with Mr. Nye about an agreement with the Independents in a moderate scheme, and he was often engaged in disputes with the Papists also. And indeed, it is amazing how one of so much weakness, who was constantly followed with divers bodily infirmities, should be capable of so much service. He came to London just before the deposition of Richard Cromwell. He preached before the Parliament the day before they voted for King Charles's return. He preached also before the Lord Mayor and aldermen of the city at St. Paul's on the day of Thanksgiving for Monk's success. And when the king was actually restored, he became one of his chaplains in ordinary in conjunction with some others of his brethren of the same sentiments with him. He preached once before him in that capacity, and often waited on him with the rest of the ministers in order to obtain by his means some terms of peace and union with the bishops and their adherents, who were many of them inclined to run things to extremity. He assisted at the Savoy Conference as one of the commissioners, and then drew up a reformed liturgy, which some persons not very likely to be prejudiced in his favor have thought to be the best of the kind they ever saw. He has under this head falling under the censure of our late English historian, who, volume 3, page 235, makes this reflection. He drew up an absolute form of his own, and styled it the Reformed Liturgy, as if he had the modesty to think that the old liturgy, compiled by a number of very learned confessors and martyrs, must now give place to a new form composed by a single man, and he by education much inferior to many of his brethren. But had this gentleman been so just as to have read the reasons which Mr. Baxter gave for his doing that which he represents, as so assuming he would have seen little occasion for his reflection. For the design of this liturgy was not to jostle out the old one, where persons were satisfied with it, but to relieve those that durst not use the old one as it was, by helping them to forms taken out of the Word of God. Or suppose we that the old liturgy had in the esteem of many fallen short of this new one. Others are at a loss to discover why this should appear so preposterous, unless it be unaccountable for persons to prefer a liturgy entirely scriptural to one that is made up of human phrases, and some of them justly enough exceptionable. It must be owned that the old liturgy was framed by sundry confessors and martyrs, and upon that account it deserved respect. And it was a great step in that day for them to cast so many corruptions out of the public service as they did at that time, when this liturgy was drawn out of the several forms that were in use in this kingdom before. But it was but a pursuit of their design to render the public service yet more scriptural, and had they risen from the dead, there is good reason to believe they would generally have approved of it, and been so far from looking upon it as detracting from them, that they would have applauded it as a good superstructure upon their foundations. Suppose then he that drew up this reformed liturgy was by education much inferior to many of his brethren, it neither follows from thence that he must really be so much inferior to them in useful knowledge and valuable abilities as this author would seem to intimate. Nor can it justly be thence argued that his performance was contemptible, nor that there was any want of modesty neither, when his brethren put him upon the undertaking, and besides, they approving it when they perused it, and joining in the presenting it, made it their own, as sufficiently appears from the preface prefixed. And some of them had academical education and great applause in the world too, and yet thought not Mr. Baxter at all their inferior. He was also one of the three that managed the dispute at the end of the conference at the Savoy, and freely charged some things in the liturgy as sinful and contrary to the Word of God. As that ministers are obliged in baptism to use the transient image of the cross, that none be admitted to communion in the Lord's Supper that dare not receive it kneeling, etc. The forementioned author, speaking of this in his history, says that it seems very strange that he and his brethren should undertake to mention 8 unlawful things in the liturgy, when they could not affirm any one of those things to be in itself unlawful, but argued altogether upon the unlawful imposition of them, which they might as well have done by the same argument in 800 of other indifferent and most innocent matters. But if this gentleman had considered that the unwarrantableness of keeping up such impositions in the church was the thing which Mr. Baxter and his brethren undertook to prove, in opposition to those who were zealous for retaining them, and how little in that case depends upon the simple unlawfulness of the things imposed, abstracting from all circumstances in a metaphysical sense, the strangeness of their proceeding would have disappeared. For though the same argument would have done in 800 indifferent things, had there been so many so imposed, yet it does not follow but that it would be good and valid in those 8 things mentioned, in which they thought they should be bound up by the ecclesiastical constitution, if they really must have been so confined, while they could not discover their compliance to be lawful.